Hi, thanks for joining us. I'm Garrett Nelson, the president and head curator at the Leventhal Map and Education Center at the Boston Public Library, and you're joining us this evening for a Brown seminar with Molly Nebiolo. Before we start tonight's program, I want to take note of the complicated and contested threads that are woven through historical geography, including difficult stories that we neither can nor should ignore. The place that we now call Boston is the ancestral and current home to Indigenous peoples. The Massachusetts people lived for thousands of years and still live today on the Shawmut Peninsula. The metropolitan region is also home to other tribes, including the Mashpee and Aquinnah Wampanoag and the Nipmuc Nations. Copley Square, where the Boston Public Library is located, sits on top of a filled tidal estuary that once featured some of the most advanced marine agricultural techniques in North America. The maps that are in the Leventhal Center collections bear witness not only to histories of colonial expropriation, but also to conflicts that range from labor struggles to racial segregation. In some cases, the maps in our collection don't simply document these stories in the past, but they actually played a role in making them happen in the first place. Through all of our programs and interpretation, exhibitions, and educational activities, we encourage visitors to consider how these histories still exert real effects on the present day. Tonight's program is part of a larger effort called American Revolutionary Geographies Online, or ARGO. ARGO, which is funded by a grant from the United States National Archives, seeks to bring together maps from dozens of collections in North America and Europe for easy digital access and interpretation. ARGO is a collaborative project between us at the Leventhal Center and our colleagues at the Center for Digital History at the Washington Library at Mount Vernon. And I'm joined tonight by my colleague, Alexandra Montgomery, who's the director for the Center for Digital History. Hi, Ala.
Hi there, everyone.
Together, the Washington Library and the Leventhal Center have built the ARGO project as a home for scholars, collectors, educators, students, and all folks from all walks of life who are interested in the geography of the Revolutionary period. We hope not only to provide better access to map collections that help us explore the American Revolution and its era in different ways, but also to provide a platform for scholars, educators, and interpreters to think about this history from a new perspective. And tonight's guest is one of the most exciting young scholars working with maps and map collections in original work in history. Please welcome Molly Nebiolo from Butler University. Hi, Molly.
Hi there.
Dr. Nebiolo is assistant professor of history at Butler University, and she holds a PhD in world history from Northeastern University here in Boston. Her monograph project, Constructing Health, Concepts of Well-Being in an Urbanizing Atlantic World, is under contract with the University of Virginia Press. Her expertise is in early Atlantic world history, the history of science and medicine, urban history, and the digital humanities. Her scholarship has been supported by the McNeil Center for Early American Studies, the American Philosophical Society, the Clements Library, and us at the Leventhal Center with a currently active small grants for digital publications fellowship. She has a wonderfully interactive website at mollynebiolo.com, which I encourage you to visit after the talk and to find a copy of her book when it arrives. We're going to turn the program over to Dr. Nebiolo to introduce us to the themes of urban space, water, and health in colonial Charleston. After Dr. Nebiolo's talk, Alexandra and I will rejoin the program for a conversation. And at the end of the program, we'll have plenty of time for conversation with the audience. If you have questions at any time, you can drop them into the comments, whether you're joining on Facebook or YouTube, and we'll try to get to as many as we can at the end of the program. Molly, I'm going to turn it over to you and take us through your research.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. First, I want to say thank you to Garrett, Alexandra, and Julia for organizing this series and for inviting me here this evening to speak about urban space, water, and health in colonial Charleston. I think it matters now more than ever that primary sources are digitized and made available for scholars, educators, and enthusiasts to access them openly and freely. At a time when scholarship is defunded or eliminated and museums or historical societies are also getting shuttered, like the recently noted closing of the Iowa Historical Society, I remain hopeful that we can keep these sources voices and perspectives alive in the work that we do to make history accessible and inclusive through events like this one and with digital archives like Argo. So without further ado, I just want to kind of lay the groundwork here and say that more broadly with my book project and with the digital humanities work that I do, I interrogate maps to better understand the past. And this kind of ultimately led me to my larger research project, and in particular, the research that I'll be talking about today, which is part of one chapter of my book itself. In colonial American towns, inhabitants living or frequenting the spaces alongside bodies of water were exposed to unique health risks. Miasmas, the formal term of putrefied or disgusting airs that carried diseases across streets and into homes and bodies, meant that diseases could move or lurk anywhere depending on the density, temperature, and smell of the air. When someone inhaled bad air, they were exposed to putrefaction, which could wreak havoc on internal organs and cause illness or long-term disease in anyone who moved about spaces that held this air. The 17th and 18th century worldview of waterways was bleak, as inhabitants regularly lived, worked, and moved near miasmatic waterways as they depended on them for transportation, trade, and communication. The relationship between cities, their waterways, and their inhabitants in the 18th century and Anglo-Atlantic world complicates our understanding of these cities as healthscapes or diseasescapes. Maps, sketches, archaeological evidence, and government papers from Charleston show how the threat of disease was a daily experience, and shows how often communities, through their collective fear and through manipulating the landscape, work together to avoid these threats. This history emphasizes the social power of miasmas in Anglo-colonial history to highlight that everyday people were constantly thinking about their health as they lived in urban environments. Maps emphasize the physical realities of living in these cities and the imagined reality of a healthier city all at the same time. Proprietors of colonies like Carolina did not discuss how the geography of the new cities would result in unequal distribution of good air. This ultimately resulted in an uneven presence of risk for inhabitants of newly planned and built cities based on what shaped each microenvironment. So here we can see map 1, where it's showing an early map of Charleston, and we can kind of see how parts of the city are farther away from the water and other parts are right along the water itself there too. And with map 2 here, which might be a little bit blurry for you all, you can see too, again, that some areas of the city are up against swampier areas, while others are either along waterways or tidal waves. And we'll be talking a little bit more about this area right here, if you can see my cursor, whereas parts of the city are completely dry right here in the middle, where they're not accessing water or swampy marshland. Yet the fear of disease exposure could have been more equally distributed among inhabitants, because people moved around so many microenvironments as they walked about the cities. As cities grew and population density increased, the risk of producing bad airs was felt by more and more people, even if they did not live along the watery or swampy environments. Laborers, servants, and the enslaved would be the ones who moved about the streets at all hours of the morning, day, and night. And it was under darkness when the potency of miasmatic airs was thought to be the strongest. In Charleston, the land around its creeks were often used as gardens and spaces of cultivation before the land was developed. These were quietly spaces of labor and farming that was commonly done by enslaved women, men, or indentured servants. Slave quarters found on Charles Pinckney's land by Daniels Creek also hint at the chance that the living quarters of enslaved groups was also placed in marshier landscapes. So I'll be talking about this a bit more in the talk, but this is the area that I'm talking about right here with Pinckney's mansion and where they were placed. Archaeological evidence also shows that poor craftsmen occupied the land even after it was covered, but still flooded. Excuse me. Although history shows the land by urban waterways was prized, the contradictory experience of purchasing and building up on land near dangerous waters could be explained by questioning who was living and working in these spheres of disease, and those that were exposed for long periods of time to miasmas. Over time, cities like Charleston became less watery as cities built outwards, narrowed riverways and coastlines, and paved over inconvenient creeks. While these infrastructural changes to landscape were largely a response to population growth, it's also a response to the city dwellers' fear and risks of falling ill. So cities were dried out, not just built up, to also make them safer for inhabitants' bodies. I interpret the history of these waterways and their threat to the health of certain communities as an example of the evolution of wasteland outlined by Vittoria de Palma. Wasteland, or land that had no purpose, was used politically, including in John Locke's two treatises of government, which argue that land is one of two characteristics. It's either useless and not cultivated, or it can be made useful through the process of cultivation. To Locke, the same piece of land can change in use over time, and it is on the owner of that land to continuously make it a paradise or make it full of cultivation or the opportunity to cultivate. Otherwise, it could arguably turned over to someone else to make use of it. Since Locke assisted in the earliest planning of Charleston as a city and as a society, his notions of what was wasteland, cultivated land, and land ownership can be seen in how colonizers engaged with landscapes of waterways, creeks, marshes, and swamps that punctuated the city landscape in Charleston. Charleston was not just situated between the Ashley and Cooper River, so the Ashley and Cooper Rivers, it was also nestled between two tidal creeks. The waterways themselves would make it challenging to build the walls of the city. The first plan and construction of the city before it grew was tucked between these two tidal creeks that we could see here with map 1, where we could see Daniels Creek, which is right up here, and then either the pronunciation is contested, so Vandross Creek or Vanderhorst Creek, depending on how you want to pronounce it. But you could see that the city itself, while it is walled, is still in its earliest phase, tucked between two creeks and then tucked between these two rivers. Flooding was a constant source of worry for the town, even if it was not a topic written about by the earliest of settlers. Oyster Point, where the city moved to from Albemarle Point, was low-lying land. Before the city invested in building up the land along the coast, what is now East Market Street, the landscape was mostly mud. Anyone working for trade or for the ships that were docked off the coast had to trudge through insect-infested mud just to get from small boats to solid ground. The presence of water was so common in the region that often the mention of marshy landscape was not only brought up during natural disasters, it was only brought up during natural disasters, because why else would they be continuously reflecting on the existence of a very muddy landscape? In 1703, Charlestonians cut trenches into the ground along the bottom of the city walls to keep out potential French or Spanish invasions. But the trench, built along the low-lying land just north of Vandross Creek, ended up becoming a human-made pond instead of a safety net for the city inhabitants. It was deep enough to regularly host wild ducks, which inhabitants had the tendency to enjoy shooting and leaving rotting in the pond, which sounds pretty nasty. And the creek fed water into the trench, leaving stagnant water that would be an issue for inhabitants for nearly 50 years when they finally filled it to build a new city hall. In the city itself, it was commonplace for streets to be flooded for long periods of time. Quote, there is at such seasons a large body of water that was retained in the streets, end quote. The streets themselves were largely unpaved long into the first few decades of the 1800s, leaving them channels of mud during the rainy seasons of winter. The only way for some areas of streets to keep from crumbling after flooding was just by the sheer foot traffic that stamped down the dirt. Quote, although the heavy rains washed much of the loose lands from its margins into its bosom, and being cut off from its source by the filling up of Buffon Street, the frequent passage of the citizens across it has at length rendered its bottom much firmer and less noxious, end quote. So the frequent passage of people as they regularly walked over the loose lands allowed the dirt to compact, making the noxious smell and texture of the ground less dangerous after it would rain. Based on the slow human-made adjustments happening in the area, Charles Pinckney saw an opportunity that allowed for the adaptation of streets and marshlands to optimize trade and reduce chances of disease. He would have maybe read Locke's two treaties because he saw an opportunity in the areas that were often considered wasteland. By the mid-18th century, the area of the tidal creek and its surrounding marshland had seen some manipulation of the landscape. So here I'm talking about Daniels Creek, which is this one farther north in Charleston. So here's the creek itself showing what it looks like when the water is flooded after it was paved over. But here with this map that's accessible on Argo, you can see how deep and far in the creek goes and can overflow on the streets. And these red dots here are pointing to where Pinckney eventually built his mansion. The walled city, by this point in time, was bursting at the seams from migration and an expanding trade route into the Carolina wilderness. Looking outward, wealthier inhabitants, like the Pinckneys, saw that the marshy landscape just outside of the city walls could, one day soon, be very, very useful. As we can see here, here is where the wall initially ended for the earliest part of Charleston's history. And there was this bridge, later called Governor's Bridge, because the mansion would be rented out to governors, going over the tidal creek. And this is the area right here that I'm talking about. A large portion of the land north of the creek was initially owned by the Colleton family, and the colloquial term Colleton Square derived from its first owner, Sir Peter Colleton. But by the 1740s, when the Colleton family bought plantation land farther inland in Carolina, the square was broken up and sold. One of those buyers was Charles Pinckney, the Chief Justice, not his son, who ended up becoming the future governor and founding father that we often think about when we hear the name Charles Pinckney. So I'm talking about senior, not junior here. He was it is still an integral figure in 18th century Charleston's history. Records show that the land around the creek was largely untouched, and even the mouth of the creek going into the Cooper River was used at times for rice production. Yet by 1747, Pinckney's records show that he paid for construction material for his home, which was agreed to be landed at the new bridge, which is the bridge that I had just mentioned, showing that a bridge had been constructed to make the land north of Queen Street more navigable as the city grew outwards. Ideas of health then in the mid-18th century in Charleston seemed to fall into the same colonial notions of human improvement and power over landscape. So you could potentially get healthier or move towards more health if you focused on improvement as well as power over the landscape to improve your outcomes. Instead of avoiding water, Pinckney was unfazed by the chance that building his mansion near the tidal creek would cause disease. He focused his attention on the chance of more land if he filled the marsher areas of the creek. The creek itself, Daniels Creek, for most of the century seemed to continue its use as a creek with only minor adjustments made to allow inhabitants, like the Pinckneys' household, to control the tidal flooding. Yet Pinckneys and potentially others did not spend much time in their mansion by the creek, making the enslaved servants and laborers for the city estate the regular inhabitants exposed to the threat from the tidal creek. Following the letters of Charles and Eliza Pinckney, the house was built in 1745, a year after they married. The land was still a swampy creek. The mansion was almost immediately rented out to the governor of South Carolina and the political families of the city, with Eliza largely spending her time out on the Pinckney and Lucas plantations, or the family was out in England. The letters that remain from Eliza while she was in South Carolina are also mostly from her time out on the plantations rather than in the city itself. Descriptions of the mansion articulate that after being built, there were servant housings and quarters for the enslaved out on the back west side of the house. This area had direct exposure to the marshy creek. Although it was likely that some of the servants and the enslaved laborers that worked closest with the Pinckneys followed them to these different plantations or went across the Atlantic Ocean to London with them, these quarters were probably occupied continuously by these communities as the house hosted a rotation of visitors. The high society of Charleston was a slave-owning one, and other records show that the enslaved laborers were often those most exposed to the creeks. The cleaning of the creeks or any reworking of the banks along canals or wharves was also done by the enslaved, exposing them to miasmatic mud and muck. Small clues about the placement and construction of Pinckney's mansion reveal that health was still considered, even if the family did not spend much of their time at the mansion. The house itself was built right in the middle of their plot of land in Carlton Square, facing east to allow for the best view of the Cooper River. Quote, the ground across the street down to the water's edge, meaning the Cooper River, also belonged to the family, was never built upon, but kept open for the air and for the view. As a descendant of Eliza Pinckney noted here, the placement of the house was chosen for the optimal openness to the air. Yes, for a view, but for the air specifically. Since Eliza Pinckney grew up in an affluent family in Antigua, it would not have been out of the ordinary to know that that space was needed to optimize healthy living near town, especially if the mansion was located off the Cooper River and next to the tidal creek to its south. Indeed, the Pinckneys seemed to respond to the regular tidal flooding of the creek in their planning of the grounds, as they left the south-facing part of the lot full of grass plats and flower beds. By leaving the land open instead of building up right next to the creek, Charles Pinckney could have been optimizing more airflow, like the riverside portion of the plot, or even using botanical knowledge to avoid the dissemination of noxious air or reduce instances of tidal flooding. Instead, roots in the grass and in the plants would keep the land packed enough to prevent eroding. Although the Pinckneys and potentially others did not stay regularly near Daniels Creek, how they oriented their plot to optimize distance from the water and reduce exposure to bad air shows how architectural orientation was a response to prevent ideas of miasmatic airs before the creek was officially filled in. And here I want to point out with map 4 right here, you can kind of see where the creek is right here alongside Pinckney's mansion, which eventually in the 19th century burns down. Otherwise, I would show you very lovely photos and pictures of it, but we don't really have it. And here is a map from about a decade later where we still see the placement of the creek and kind of very little manipulation of its location and where the city is as well. The future of Daniels and Vandross's creeks that once hugged the city of Charleston slowly transformed into canals to make transportation around the expanding city of Charleston easier as more people settled in the city. Visualizations like maps 2, 3, and 4 would show inhabitants with plots of land that tended to flood. These plats also reflect that even a century after the settlement of Charleston, marshland was still very present in the city's landscape. Maps such as these could have been used to show how people could avoid miasmatic dangers. And I have found when I was looking through Argo a bit that there are some instances in which there's a plat of the map of Charleston, and then there's a plat at high tide. So there's an importance given to what the city looks like at high tide and how it compares to maybe other instances when it's at lower tide. They were also used to illustrate the demands to fill in marshes and creeks to prevent regular flooding outlined in these plats. Erosion of the seawall along East Bay Street catalyzed the process of paving over Vandross Creek to turn into Water Street. And after each storm or flood, inhabitants faced the challenge of staying healthy once they were surrounded by floodwater. They were unable to travel successfully across East Bay Street, east to Bay Street, down the peninsula during times of flooding, which occurred regularly enough by the end of the 18th century that inhabitants argued for a floodgate to be built. The Common Council minutes for the city noted that the slow progression of filling in the creek. So instead of completely paving it over, groups of neighbors whose land abutted the creek would fill in the water, as was done between Church Street and East Bay Street. By 1785, a city ordinance was passed to continue East Bay Street down to Oyster Point. So we're seeing East Bay Street moving down this way. This project, which took nearly 3 years to complete, shone a light in the area around Vandross Creek. While the area was still referred to as part of the creek in 1784, by 1798, Water Street was replacing the creek on maps of the city. And by the early 1800s, the city constructed a storm wall that finally allowed Water Street to stay dry during high tide. Daniels Creek was also turned into a canal before ultimately getting turned into Market Street by 1804. So if any of you have been to Charleston and been to Market Street and notice how it dips in, so not only are you going through the market itself, but you notice kind of the land dipping in, that's because they filled in the tidal creek there. Yet by the latter half of the 18th century, it was still more useful to inhabitants than the city's other creeks. As mentioned earlier, the mouth of Daniels Creek was marshy and rumored to have been used for cultivation of rice in the early 17th century. Later, markets were erected nearby as the city grew outside its walls. The mercantile traffic around Daniels Creek continued as the creek was modified into a canal to control flooding. The tidal nature of the creek also allowed fishermen to use the area as a fish market during high tides. By putting up barriers in the canal, they could keep the fish alive and fresh longer during market days without the putrefaction constructing stink of dead fish permeating the neighborhoods around the creek, adding to the perpetual danger of miasmatic airs. However, its use for market days was ultimately overlooked by the need for a regular road for carriages to move to and from the governor's house up the coast of the river, and larger population of the city meant a bigger need for a market to be built. The canal slowly filled in from inland out to the mouth of the canal. And map 5 shows the planning of Market Street. My apologies, map 6 shows the planning of Market Street to fit into the city landscape when the creek was formally paved over in 1804. And I know this is kind of hard to read. Somebody lovely put lines going against it, but we see here this kind of area right here of building out the street for Market Street here. So pretty much building and filling in right here to fit into the city landscape when the creek was formerly paved over in 1804. It's difficult to pinpoint if replacing Daniels Creek with a permanent market space lessened the exposure of miasmatic air to the inhabitants, as contemporaries from the era mentioned dogs eating the carcasses and meat that was dumped at the end of each day onto the dusty streets, which isn't, as healthy as one might expect, or as we would assume that if the streets are drier, that it would be more healthy. But now we're seeing other instances causing miasmatic errors. So the paving of Daniels Creek and Vandross's Creek kind of show how each city community dealt with the challenges of living near city waterways. Given the prevalence of miasma theory in the Anglo-Atlantic world, the daily interaction of living along watery or marshy land near the city made life challenging for Charlestonians. How the land around the creeks developed and was recognized, how the creeks developed and recognized the daily movements of inhabitants, particularly enslaved and indentured laborers, hints at what their experiences would have been. Although it took a slow process, the creeks in Charleston slowly transformed from wasteland into more useful land, and the city government would state it as healthier spaces. Highlighting these microenvironments disrupts an understanding that early colonial cities were equally threatening to one's health. Instead, the advocacy, construction, and movement by inhabitants around these spaces uncovers a daily fear of infection because these early cities were watery. The threat was more universal, but the exposure to these threats were unevenly distributed. Filling and paving projects did not just happen quickly at the end of the 18th century, but resulted from decades of everyday disgust and adaptation to these growing inconveniences, and after decades of ignoring the experiences of indentured enslaved laborers as well. Inhabitants regularly considered their health even when outbreaks were absent from the cities because of how watery their cityscapes ended up being in the first 100 years of colonization. Thank you.
Amazing. Thanks, Molly. We are going to have a conversation with Molly, Alexandra, and I about the wonderful presentation you just heard. But I also want to encourage folks in the audience to drop questions in the chat at any time. About quarter of, we'll turn to audience questions, and we welcome you to ask questions about Professor Nebiolo's research, about the presentation, about maps and historical geography more broadly, or about the Argo project in general. Alexandra, do you want to jump in with the first question?
Sure. Thanks, Garrett. Thank you so much, Molly, for this presentation. This was really fascinating. I love any opportunity, of course, to look at maps, and I often find I spend not enough time thinking about urban spaces in the 18th century, so it's always really welcome to hear more about what these spaces were like. And so to that end, I would just love to hear you sort of reflecting on what your closing statement about the sort of universal and yet also unequally distributed, I think you said, threats of a miasmatic city, to reflect on how Charleston, the experience of Charleston looks like when you also look at it in comparison with other urban spaces in the 18th century. As you were talking, for example, I was thinking about Dock Street in Philadelphia, which is a space I know a little bit better, which is a similar sort of wretched miasmatic swamp creek that gets paved over during this period. So I'd just love to hear from you, what are the things about this story that are really Charleston, and how does it look as part of a much of a larger narrative about unhealthful, watery, damp cities?
Thank you so much for that question, and thank you for bringing up Dock Street. So the larger chapter itself is a comparison and contrasting with Dock Street itself in Philadelphia too. So my book project is kind of not just comparing, but putting in conversation kind of the urbanizing history of these two pre-planned cities, because Philadelphia and Charleston follow the specific pre-plan that happened, that kind of came about after the plague and the Great Fire in London itself. So I appreciate you bringing that up. How is this story specifically Charleston? Particularly when we're comparing it to something to a city like Philadelphia, what makes Charleston unique is not just its climate, but the fact that a lot of this water or exposure to water or the wateriness of the city is tidal. So you can't necessarily control the tides per se. It was already very, very difficult to be able to make land drier in the first place. So I think the emphasis of recognizing not just the fact that inhabitants were continuously arguing for making spaces healthier for themselves, but how they were actively trying to adapt to the fact that, like, well, this is tidal, we're recognizing that this is a totally new landscape when it reaches high tide in the city. We see it in the maps, in the way that people are attempting to map a pattern of what high tide looks like in Charleston to potentially use to like navigate the city in a different way. So I think that tidal aspect really makes this story Charleston compared to something like Dock Creek, where the creek itself exists. And yes, it kind of slowly dries up and becomes really muddy and more miasmatic over the course of the 18th century. But that's not necessarily because the water is flowing out. It's because people are dumping a bunch of stuff in there. And so the water kind of gets absorbed into all of the refuse and garbage, and things kind of build up, and it starts getting filled in without people really trying to fill it in the first place. So there's different kind of threats there that we see comparing Philadelphia and Charleston. And I think there was a second part to your question, and I was wondering if you could repeat it or if I maybe already answered it.
No, I think you more or less answered it. I was just looking. I love that Dock Street is already in your work. That's perfect. Yeah, but just the ways in which because it's sort of, it's one of those things, like whenever I hear about these 18th century urban spaces, a common thread is that the disgustingness and prevalence of stagnant water and sort of miasma. But so the two parts of the question were just what is universal, what is specific, and I feel like your answer really hit on both of those things.
Awesome. The last point that I will say to kind of like close with that is that you see kind of an unevenness in exposure too. I'm not able to find, if only the archives had it, like what everybody's daily movements across the cities were like, but just understanding how people would move about the city, knowing that I have to move past this creek weekly to go to market to get my food or to figure something out, or I live a block away, and that experience is very much different than people who live maybe 4 or 5 blocks away down Front Street. Like you can kind of draw comparisons based off of that spatial information and geographic information as well. What else was I going to say? My apologies. But like in Charleston too, it's so small that it's hard not to be exposed to or not to like be around these spaces as well, especially if maybe it rains too hard during rainier seasons, a hurricane comes through or a tropical storm comes through. So that landscape kind of really changes a lot, and it's harder to avoid those spaces in a way where I haven't really made the comparison, but in Philadelphia, I could maybe see people getting away with avoiding, you know, the Dock Creek area if they just like stayed farther north in the city. But part of the chapter also, and this was the thing that I was forgetting momentarily because I'm a morning person, I'm not an evening person, is the fact that in Philadelphia specifically, there's this kind of through line narrative of, well, it's not that bad and not that gross and not that dangerous because we don't have recorded deaths. So there's kind of this argument of we're not going to do anything different for a while because we don't actually have any data showing that a person died because Dock Creek is really, really gross. That's what Thomas Penn says when the citizens write to him in London saying, hey man, we really need to do something about this creek. And he's like, well, I don't think there's anything wrong with it unless you want to tell me otherwise, even though he has not visited the creek itself. And you kind of see a similar type of like lack of information of people, like of mortality data around these spaces, which kind of makes sense because if it's like daily interactions, and obviously we know that, you know, miasma doesn't necessarily exist and it's germ theory, et cetera, but still constant exposure to certain types of pollutants that could be living there, or, you know, like mosquitoes thriving in some of these areas as well. So it's interesting to see how both places have a lack of mortality data that is used kind of for political reasons to fill both spaces up.
Fascinating.
It's so interesting, Molly. I love the way that you kind of show how these tidal flats were an environmental and economic problem for the colonists in Charleston and the town administrators. One thing I was curious about is if you think that that's more than coincidentally related to the fact that it was also kind of a cartographic problem, right? You know, what's interesting to me is, of course, we have like very good cartography of harbor spaces. You know, marine charts are well developed in the 18th century, and then we're also getting good urban plans, land, you know, terra firma plans of hard urban spaces at this time. And one thing that patrons at the Leventhal Center often notice about our 18th century maps of Boston is they all show tidal flats kind of a different visual convention, right? So sometimes it's like shaded over, and sometimes it's sort of artistically rendered with hatchers. Occasionally, you know, a different color has been used, and even in the set of maps you showed, these creeks like look different, right? They're sort of hard to map because they're kind of watery, kind of land, not really either of them. So I'm curious how, you know, the folks who were making these maps of Charleston, you know, was the visual rhetoric of this like unmappability in a way, or this like confusing to map space. Was that related to how administrators and you know, the folks who are filling and engrossing and enclosing and selling the land are also treating it as a kind of problem because it's not useful harbor water, it's not useful enclosable land that you made into property, but it's like some weird combination of the two.
I think that's a really fantastic point. I will say it's very generative because I'm thinking about, so I haven't interrogated this specific question in my research, and I love it, that it's like really, really hard to map tides. Particularly in a colonial setting, and like how does that appear in the archive when I'm reading a lot of these government papers? No, it's all kind of stories through word of mouth and not necessarily any cartographic information, which is also something that is kind of standing out to me as you were speaking this right now. So that's really inspiring because now I want to sit down and reevaluate some of these sources as well, because it's not like I don't see in Common Council minutes or when people are complaining, because a lot of what gets recorded, especially when I'm trying to find the voices of inhabitants in like government papers, right? It's always because they're complaining because that's what gets written down. Like, it's not like, wow, you're doing really great, thank you for not paving over this road. Like, or, you know, like it's always like people are angry and they're complaining about something here. And they're trying to fight for something and fight for change. But I don't see this kind of narrative discussion of like how difficult it is to pin down the way the city looks or is experienced during the tides itself. And that I find that is particularly interesting. There was another point that I wanted to make. Oh, one of the maps that I used in my presentation, and I don't know if we can kind of go back to it.
Sure.
Oh, fantastic. I didn't know how easy that was to do. So this map in particular, where is it? This one, I found super interesting. So it's an attempt of, I believe, the British to try and map out Charleston during the siege of Charleston, during the American Revolution. And you can see here how well they actually like are labeling and trying to color in swamps and know the area of like swampy waterways. So like even the British who are occupying this space, and there's many reasons why they need to know this information, prioritize when they're drawing things out very hastily, it seems, not just fortifications and the importance of seeing where streets are. And I'm so interested in kind of refiguring out where some of these like undefined streets and lines that just end are like on finished maps. But the fact that it's so important that they know where the swampiness is, they know where the marshland is. So even though it might be like nearly impossible for maybe a whole bunch of people to scientifically agree on what is considered a swamp and what is considered a marshland and what is considered, you know, like firm land that maybe gets flooded every once in a while, it's still fascinating to see in these instances of war later on that the information that is most important is like what is watery, what is dangerous, and then what is not, what is navigable. So I think you bring up a lot of really great points. Thank you.
Yeah, and I love this map too. I mean, like you pointed out, you know, there's still this sort of like the marshy or intertidal area kind of like has edges, right? And you know, we sort of like intuit that that's maybe like a low tide and a high tide boundary, but it's so challenging to actually relate that cartographic convention onto the actual natural environment of the time. And oftentimes, you know, we'll show maps of Phil in Boston. And when we compare it against, you know, what few sort of early photographs in the 19th century we have of that neighborhood, they like almost don't match at all, right? What you would have imagined on the map is so different from what it actually felt like in its material conditions. And I love the way that you kind of draw us back to like the actual inhabited practices of dealing with this space that was much more complicated and blurry and probably quite heterogeneous rather than just like, you know, a swamp with an edge and it begins here and it ends there.
Well, the thing that kind of to go on a very like small, it's not a tangent, but like the first time I was ever in Charleston to do research for this project was in like January of 2021. So it was still like very pandemic-y. It was still hit or miss on if I could go. Like no one was there. I was just this random person who just showed up in January, like hoping to not get sick. But during the week that I was there, they got a lot of rain. I would argue it was not that much rain, but I guess it was a lot of rain. And they actually had to close the archives like a half a day early because the tidal flooding would make it hard for everybody to drive over the one bridge to leave Charleston. And that just like really stuck with me. And they would like, the archivists were telling me like, it's difficult to have, you know, the archives on the third floor with so much rain because, you know, like the exposure to rain or the possibility for potential leaks or flooding is bad for sure. And then me physically walking from the archives in the rain and like everything is super muddy and there's like pockets and like, you know, potholes everywhere. And if I didn't have, you know, my LL Bean boots, I would have been soaked through. So just like that physical experience of being like, okay, 300, 400 years later, like not to throw shade at, you know, the infrastructures of Charleston, like I can imagine what that experience was like because people still have to be like, oh, it's raining today, we need to close early, which I like had not experienced before unless it was like a tropical storm or a hurricane or something like that.
Yeah, no, sort of two points going off of this great conversation. The first is I'm reminded actually, Garrett, of one of our earlier round seminars with Michelle Navakis about mapping Florida,
Yeah.
and about just how the cartographic, the difficulty of figuring out how to map really
Yeah.
watery, marshy, swampy spaces.
Mhm.
So I was thinking about that when you were talking about that as well. And then the other thing, I mean, I am constantly there's a sense in which we got better than we were in the 18th century at doing infill and controlling water, but we can't totally control it. There's still a
Mhm.
sense of, you go into a modern city and when it floods you can kind of still tell where the rivers are supposed to be.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's a
Yeah.
way in which we never actually figured out how to do it.
Yeah.
For sure. And there's such a nice almost like conceptual symmetry here, right? With like this sort of like Enlightenment project. You talk about lock-in ideas of property.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
Cartographic practices, which are trying to fix space into some perfect geometric
Mhm.
order so that it can be sold and made productive. And then we're constantly reminded how the world kind of exceeds those attempts to pin it down, either to map it and make a a very stable, clear cartographic line where the water begins and ends. And to this day, we still have topography, we still have rain. Can I ask you, Molly, maybe a kind of methodological question about your use of digital maps in this project and in your historical work more broadly? Obviously, we're talking to you on the internet, and you've showed us some beautifully digitized maps from many different collections, some of which are in Argo right now, others which are from your own research. You've also published and worked on several exciting digital humanities projects that involve taking 18th century information, turning into modern map data. How do the tools of the digital humanities shape this project and your work as a scholar more generally?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Not only does doing that work let me like play around and look at maps more, which is always a win in my book, but it helps me ask more fruitful questions. It also pushes me to understand or to think about what data I can pull from historical sources. And this is what I try to teach my undergraduate students when I'm teaching an intro to DH class, or when I'm trying to explain it to other folks too, who might not be as like digitally savvy or haven't dabbled in the digital humanities, particularly with maps. I think they help you ask a lot of really fantastic questions, but it also includes many different layers of data, not just, let's say, a map that shows where a street is and thus where plots of land are and where a building might be, but it begs the question of like, how big are these streets? Yes, you might be drawing it and it's looking uniform because that's the imagined idea of what they want it to look like, or it's also just easier to draw the same lines over and over again. But what is like the width of these streets and the length of these streets and what's happening on the corners of some of these streets as well? So looking at a map helps me ask a lot of very fruitful questions that kind of springboard into going into the archives to find the right information to kind of fill those gaps. And then using digital tools, I'm able to, or I attempt to try and layer that data together to make it into one more visually appealing and easier to read set of data as well. I've made this joke to my students to hopefully inspire them when they get really, really frustrated because they can't read cursive or they think history is lame and they don't know how to connect with it. One of the kind of broader stories I tell and what inspired me with this research project is that I got really angry at maps and I like wanted to find out more, and I hated the way that maps have been used in books as pictures and not as like instances of data, like reading a letter or reading another written document or something like that. And so I got inspired to really engage with maps to understand kind of this story. The biggest, like the one that's coming to mind is the 1682 map of Philadelphia, where it's like, hey, this is what Philly looks like. No, it is not. This is what you want Philly to look like, but also like, this is really empty and this is a whole bunch of lines. So don't throw this photo in on a chapter on colonial Philadelphia and then tell me like, here's what Philly looked like. So it inspired me through some frustrations to really try to fill in those gaps and then better visualize or better push myself and others to see the importance of those visualizations in showing a whole bunch of data. So even though you don't see people in the space, maybe they're presenting people in a different way that we can engage with more. So it just has been really inspiring. And as a visual learner, it helps me kind of step back and look at it almost like an artist does, or someone like carving wood or like marble or something, to be like, what else is here that I haven't looked at before? Like, what is the different angling here? What is the experience here that it's trying to show me, but maybe I can look elsewhere to help fill in those gaps. So
it's such a great critique of what I call the book cover approach to maps. It's like, I'm writing a book about George Washington, so I put a portrait of George Washington. I'm writing a book about Charleston, so I put a map of Charleston, and
yeah.
there ends my engagement with maps. One of the things that we admire so much about your work, which you talked about today, is just the way you treat the map as such an interesting jumping off point for thinking about the actual built environment, you know, how people are engaging with it and transforming and shaping it to their own ends. I wanted to ask a question about whether, you know, I'm going to do the thing that historians hate and draw you right up to the present day, but right, these contestations over urban health and administration could obviously hardly be more live in our present day. Do you see echoes over this, you know, these kind of struggles in the 18th century to control and regularize nature that are maybe putatively about health, but you know, as you argue, are just as much about ownership and certain visions of urban form and profitability? You know, we are still struggling with how to regulate public health questions. Are there any connections you might draw to sort of more recent examples of environmental health struggles or challenges in urban settings?
Oh, for sure. So I was living in Boston during the pandemic, and then I lived in Philly, kind of in the immediate post-pandemic, so kind of like hot vax summer, when it still like was not great, but we had vaccines, so we're going to pretend it's fine. So that intermediate period of time. So being in these two major cities that are colonial cities, that are very, very small because they're small colonial cities, and seeing kind of the differences in the way that people occupied space, but also some of the similarities were really, really cool, comparing it and drawing it back to the 17th and 18th century. So after I got over the like trauma turned to interest of like, oh, I'm already studying this. Oh, I'm studying this and living this 24/7. Oh, wait, this is really cool. Humans are resilient. Like once I moved past that kind of like arc of feelings, I noticed this similarity, especially after a few months of the COVID-19 pandemic, where everyone just got really, really frustrated and like needed space, particularly in Boston, but this also happened in Philadelphia, where they shut down, like purposely shut down certain streets so like people won't get hit by cars because they're walkable streets. So in Boston, for folks who like don't know the city super well, they did this periodically with a certain stretch of Memorial Drive on Sundays during the summer to allow like people and their kids to bike around, which is very, very cute. I believe that precursed COVID-19. However, that extended even further, and it ended up being like every single Sunday, every single summer. And I think that continues to this day, where there's chunks of Memorial Drive that are shut down on Sundays, but then there'd be other semi-major streets that would be shut down for people to move about. And we can also see instances of that where restaurants who were struggling, most restaurants, they opened up outside and had this outdoor seating, being outside and spaced out aspect that so many people enjoyed, that particularly in Boston, in the Somerville area, people petitioned to have that be a thing that happened every single year, that they wouldn't shut down post-COVID, because everyone loved this kind of outdoor, let's reclaim these spaces. A street isn't necessarily just for cars. It's also for people to be outside and to enjoy that space. And I wrote a couple pieces kind of tying that kind of past to present, because the like formation of some of the widest streets in Philadelphia were planned out to make them healthy, spaced out areas for people, not just for the markets themselves, but specifically for people to use in many different ways. And it's interesting to see that we reverted back to that at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic too, in a different way, where we recognize 6 feet of distance allowed for the healthiest of airs for all of us, so we could still be outside and enjoy it too. So that's one big example where I've seen complements across time and space. But I mean, that's just like an everyday instance kind of during our pandemic experience. But if we're comparing like epidemic experience and other pandemic experiences like 1793 to COVID-19 today, that opens up a whole other, I think, opportunity to like do another lecture discussion. So I'll stop there, but really seeing how people reverted back to, hey, this is our space. It's not just for cars, or not just for like horse and wagons and things like that. Like, this is for us to use in the way that we need it to be used to keep us healthy, I think is one big example.
So all of that raises a question for me, which kind of then draws us back in the opposite direction. If we just went forward, going further back, which is thinking about Boston and Philly, you know, both colonial city, both 17th century cities, but very, very different, right? Yeah. Philadelphia has this whole sort of pre-planned imaginary grid that you can create a map of, and then you have to be like, no, it's not real, but it exists, right? It's an idea. And Boston, the joke is always like, you know, they paved the cow paths, you can walk in a straight line and you end up back where you started somehow magically. And you sort of alluded to some of the pre-planned nature of Charleston as well. Were these sort of pre-planned cities, is there a health aspect encoded into the way those are laid out, or are they perceived as more healthful by being sort of premeditated in some way?
So that's the whole premise of my book, is that yes, that's my
argument.
And that's where I'm like, wow, that is so well said, because that's the soundbite that I need to remind like my editor down the road when we're like, wait, what's the point of this again? This is the point of this.
Fabulous.
So both Charleston and Philadelphia follow the grand model scheme, which I think I mentioned earlier before jumping into the presentation, which was kind of this idea, Enlightenment idea, this part of this larger discussion of like, what is improvement? So I think Kate Mulry does a really, really good job of writing about like the movement of improvement in England, but then in other parts of the colonial Anglo-Atlantic world as well, after the plague and after the Great Fire kind of resets, if you will, London as a society and as a major city. So both of these cities, like this idea of a pre-plan, I have found that there's a push for health. There's this kind of argument that this plan will make these places healthier, and moving here to these pre-planned cities will ultimately make you be a healthier person. So there's this kind of promotion and propaganda that pushes this specific city plan for Charleston and then Philadelphia, and both the proprietors, so William Penn and Lord Ashley, like push this idea that this is the answer to all of our problems. This is the optimal city that will make you healthier. And then later generations kind of push to continue to make the cities healthier, because due to commercializing and kind of like economic like wealth and growth and movements to be wealthier, people kind of went against a lot of these plans, right? Like things that happen on the frontier aren't exactly as they plan to be. But what I find unique is that the inhabitants of both of these cities in particular continuously kind of push back against the government, and almost are reminding them, hey, this is supposed to be really, really healthy. Like, y'all promised, you know, like even after everybody's at, y'all promised us this would be better. This needs to be better. And so I'm kind of looking at that in my book with various case studies, like longer into the 18th century, until about the time when boards of public health come about in a post 1793 world.
I love it. I'm obsessed. I cannot wait for the book. Thrilled.
Yeah, it's really exciting, Molly. We all can't wait to get our hands on it. We're just about at the top of the hour, and I see lots of likes for the presentation. But I've either satisfied all of the audience members' questions, or Ala and I have already asked the questions that were on people's minds. So I'm going to say thanks to Professor Molly Nebiolo of Butler University for joining us. Make sure you visit the Argo project online at argomaps.org, where you can find many of the maps in Professor Nebiolo's presentation. We'll also be posting the recording of tonight's presentation on Argo, together with a selection of maps that are paired with Professor Nebiolo's research. Thanks to Dr. Alexander Montgomery from the Center for Digital History at the Washington Library at Mount Vernon for joining me. And thanks to all of you for tuning in tonight. Have a nice evening.
Awesome. Thank you.